A single crossbow bolt killed Sultan Mehmed II on May 29, 1453, and Constantinople never fell. The young conqueror was inspecting forward saps near the Saint Romanus Gate at dusk, 3 days before his planned final assault, when a Genoese marksman on the inner walls loosed a shot through the gap between two mantlets. The bolt struck him through the throat. He died within the hour, in a tent behind the great bombards, surrounded by viziers who immediately understood that the empire was now leaderless before a city it had not yet taken. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. For 2 days, the death was suppressed. Halil Pasha Chandarli, the Grand Vizier who had always opposed this siege, ordered the body wrapped and the tent sealed. He told the army the Sultan was wounded but would recover. He needed time to send couriers east, to think, to count the loyalties of men who had, until that morning, belonged to a single will. But the soldiers in the trenches could already feel the silence on the high ground behind them. Something had broken at the top of the camp, and what no one outside that tent yet knew would unmake the Ottoman century before it had begun. By the third day, the secret was unkeepable. Halil dispatched riders to Manisa to summon Prince Bayezid, Mehmed's elder son, then 6 years old, and held in the household of his governor-tutors. At the same time, a faction in the camp pressed forward, the infant Mustafa, under a regency that would conveniently leave Halil himself as the effective ruler. Zaganos Pasha, who had backed the war from the start, refused to accept either child without a fight, and the council that should have planned the final assault instead spent its hours arguing over guardianships and seals. Outside the tent, the army began to dissolve. Akinji raiders, paid in plunder rather than coin, simply rode away when no plunder came. Anatolian beys, men whose loyalty to Mehmed had been personal rather than dynastic, gathered their retinues and turned east to secure their own lands before some rival did it for them. The bombards stood cold on their platforms. The fleet in the Bosphorus, leaderless, drifted at anchor. Within a week, the trenches that had taken 7 weeks to dig were emptying faster than they had been filled. By mid-June, what had been the largest army assembled in Europe in a generation was a column of dust on the road to Edirne. Constantine XI Palaiologos rode out of the Saint Romanus Gate on the morning of June 18th, alone but for a small guard, and dismounted at the lip of the abandoned Ottoman trench. He blessed it. There is a chronicle that describes him weeping, and another that insists he did not. What every account agrees upon is that within hours of his return to the city, lookouts on the sea walls reported sails, a Genoese galley fleet from Chios, laden with grain and silver, which had been waiting in the islands for word of the city's fate, and now came into a harbor that still belonged to Christendom. That evening, Hagia Sophia held a service of thanksgiving. Greek priests and Latin priests sang their rites side by side under the Great Dome, and Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, who 6 months earlier had proclaimed the Union of Florence to a hostile congregation, stood beside the emperor without being shouted down. The reconciliation was not real. Many in the crowd crossed themselves in the Greek manner and muttered the old refrain about the turban being preferable to the tiara. But the turban was gone, and the tiara, for the first time in centuries, was offering bread. The price of survival arrived in the autumn. Venetian and Genoese envoys, who had spent the summer pretending to negotiate with each other, sat down in Galata in October and drew up what would be called the Treaty of the Golden Horn. Doge Francesco Foscari sent his most experienced ambassador. The Genoese, whose crossbow had ended the siege and whose grain had fed the city, demanded recognition of that fact in writing. The compromise was a joint protectorate. Constantine retained the diadem, the liturgy, and the title of Emperor of the Romans. The walls remained his. But customs revenues of the Bosphorus, the minting of coin, the management of grain reserves, and the upkeep of the fleet passed to a Latin council seated in Galata, with rotating Venetian and Genoese chairs. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who had survived the siege with a wound that would have killed him a month later under any other circumstances, was named military commander of the city's garrisons. The Byzantines had not lost their empire. They had, in a quieter way, ceased to govern it. Bayezid, raised quickly to the sultanate at Edirne after his half-brother's regents were killed in a palace skirmish, inherited a throne that needed a victory. Europe was closed. The Bosphorus belonged to Latin galleys he could not match. So he turned east, where every Ottoman sultan since Bayezid I had turned when humiliated in the west. He campaigned against the Karamanids in central Anatolia with some success, taking Konya in a winter march that his court poets compared prematurely to the campaigns of his grandfather. Then he probed further into the lands where Uzun Hasan of the Ak-Koyunlu was consolidating a confederation of Turkmen tribes and Persian cities. At Erzincan in 1461, Uzun Hasan inflicted a defeat sharp enough to halt Ottoman expansion at the Euphrates for a generation. The Ottomans were still a great power. They were no longer the only one. The bill for Latin protection came due in the pulpits. With Venetian gold in the treasury and Genoese companies on the walls, Greek bishops who refused to commemorate the Pope at the liturgy began to find themselves quietly retired to monasteries on remote islands. Their replacements were Unionists, often educated in Italy. Riots in Thessalonica in 1458 and on Mount Athos the following spring were put down by mixed Byzantine-Genoese companies, and the memory of those companies of Latin soldiers entering Athonite courtyards settled into Orthodox memory as a wound that would not close. The Union of Florence held in Constantinople because the alternative was unthinkable. It did not hold in the hearts of the people. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, the slow realization, across 2 generations, that the Greek world had been saved by becoming, in many of the ways that mattered, no longer entirely Greek. Barred from Europe and bruised in Persia, Ottoman ambition found its outlet to the south. Beginning in the 1470s, a long war with the Mamluk Sultanate over the Cilician passes drew Ottoman armies into Syria. Aleppo fell in 1485. Damascus capitulated 3 years later after a siege that the Mamluks, weakened by plague and palace coups, could not lift. Cairo held. The Mamluk regime survived, diminished, as a client of the Ottomans rather than a peer. But the trade routes that had once flowed through the Bosphorus into Constantinople and out to Italian galleys were now permanently rerouted. Spice came north through Aleppo to Tripoli, or south through the Red Sea to Mamluk-Ottoman shared customs houses. The Latin Council in Galata grew rich on what passed through. Venice and Genoa, no longer rivals so much as joint shareholders in an empire they did not formally rule, prospered together for the first time in 2 centuries. The Greek scholars stayed. There was no flight to Florence, no Bessarion arriving in exile with manuscripts wrapped in oilcloth. The libraries of Constantinople remained where they had been built, and the printing presses of Venice opened bilingual offices in Pera, producing Greek and Latin editions side by side from the 1480s onward. Plato and Aristotle were read in the West, as they were in our own history, but they were read in dialogue with Greek scholars who were still alive in their own city, defending their own readings, rather than as relics rescued from a dead empire. The Atlantic voyages still happened. Columbus still sailed. The Portuguese still rounded the Cape. But the Mediterranean did not become a backwater because the eastern terminus of its trade was still a Christian capital, taxed by Latin officials, garrisoned by Latin troops, ruled in name by a Greek emperor who had become a kind of sacred figurehead. And the great rupture between the Orthodox and Catholic worlds, which in our timeline hardened around the catastrophe of 1453 and the long Ottoman captivity that followed, instead hardened around something subtler and more bitter, a managed rivalry within a shared house in which neither side ever quite forgave the other for the price of survival. A bolt fired in the dusk by a man whose name no chronicle records had not saved a city. It had only changed the shape of the wound.